Welcome to the latest episode of the Provoke Media podcast. I'm Aarti Shah. I'm CMO at MBooth, and just for today, I am the guest host for the Provoke Media podcast. I, along with my two guests, have recently returned from the Provoke Global Conference in Chicago. And whether you attended or not, I think you'll find this conversation illuminating and insightful as we're going to glean some highlights from the two-day conference, maybe read some tea leaves into what this could mean for 2026 and beyond. So first, I'd like to welcome my guests. Kathryn Metcalfe probably needs no introduction with this audience, but I'll give one anyways. She is former CCO of CVS and has held similarly senior roles at Bristol Myers, Aetna, amongst other companies. Currently, she's a professor at NYU, New York University, and is leading an effort at Page to define functional excellence. We also have Jennifer Teitler here, who is an EVP and consumer practice lead at MBooth. And a little bit of trivia I recently learned. Jen is perhaps our most tenured employee at MBooth. She joined in 1997, which means she's been at MBooth for a whopping 28 years.
Hi.
Love
Welcome,
it.
right? Welcome, Kathryn and Jen.
Happy to be
Glad
here.
to
Thanks
be
for the
here.
invite.
Yeah, I think what made my brain break a little bit was that 1997 was 28 years ago. But um, we're excited to have this conversation. All three of us attended this event. Um, and I wanted to start with a topic that really dominated the conference, which was AI. And I think it's fair to say that the event was all in on the subject. In fact, one stat really stood out to me. It was from the Boston Consulting Group, I believe, and they said 80% of the work that we do in communications falls within what they're calling the AI collaboration sweet spot, where AI acts as a force multiplier for the human capability. So building on that, I saw a lot of excitement at the conference around AI's growing potential to sort of analyze different scenarios and predict how specific messages might resonate with specific audiences. And then I guess my question here is this sort of led to a conversation about, is AI going to dictate strategy? And the feedback that I heard at least was that no, but it would give humans greater confidence in the strategies they choose. And so, this kind of led to a conversation about keeping sort of humans in the loop. So I guess my question for you all, my first question is, how do you train, how do you think about training sort of these humans in the loop, not only for today's talent, but even future generations of talent who are going to come of age with an entirely different experience set in relationship to AI than the three of us here today have?
So, fantastic question. I'll jump in first with the student perspective, and then Jen, turn it to you for the agency perspective. It's something we spend a lot of time at NYU really discussing, and there are a lot of viewpoints on the impact. Certainly, I think for the economy, the job market, where people are at, a lot of people worry about AI eliminating, layers and levels and, really diminishing the jobs in PR and communications. Personally, I see AI a little differently. I think AI will help usher in the golden era, if you will, for communications, because with AI, we can do things that we've only dreamed about doing in the past. We never had the budget to do the kind of research, the message testing, and the work that we really wanted to do. So I think AI will really make us better and smarter, and more effective if we use it correctly. And I think that's a piece that we're still sorting out. All agencies are doing AI initiatives. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of how and what and where do you use them best. And I think that's where we're going to see, the fruits of those investments coming out in the next couple of years. But Jen, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, just stepping back, I feel like the overall kind of sentiment around AI at the conference was optimistic, amidst a lot of the kind of pessimistic gloom and doom scenarios we see play out in the press. I thought the conversation with the Boston Consulting Group was really interesting. And he talked about how they're trying to create synthetic FTEs, but not with the goal of eliminating jobs, with the goal of upskilling, the talent that they have to focus on things that automation can't do. And so that to me was promising. I think on the topic of training, one thing I'll just say, Kathryn, like I have a 14-year-old son, and I was working on a training module for our agency. And he said, "What are you working on?" I told him, "We're training people how to use AI." And he said, "What do you mean you're training people how to use AI? You just use it." So I think, it's twofold. One is we need to really have an environment of, a learning culture where people just feel like they can be empowered to dive in and try and test the tools, right? Not everything has to wait for a training. And then second, I think we need to think about how we're training our talent to not just use AI, but really question it and question the outcomes. I think, Aarti, the conversation that you were referencing was around crisis scenario, right? And how do you train people to evaluate the outcome of AI if they've never had that practical boots on the ground experience? So I think also, having some mentorship set up where you're pairing, some of the entry level talent with the more seasoned communications professionals to actually get that kind of practical learning and boots on the ground experience. And then really just making sure we're always documenting in playbooks and in case studies the work that we've done. But I think that, I agree with you, Kathryn, that AI, is an opportunity for us to really upskill and uplevel our talent. So to me, that's almost a retention strategy for staff, right?
I really like
Yeah,
you emphasized the optimistic piece because everyone on stage pretty much was quite bullish about AI, and I thought that was an interesting point that you made, Jennifer, right about training like AI and your son's observation, right? It's almost like telling our generation like, oh, we need to train people how to use the internet, and it's like no, you just
exactly.
use the internet.
Just use
Yes,
it.
yes. Well, so I'm going to jump around a little bit because I want to also get to, but you both mentioned kind of reskilling the workforce around this. So another stat that stood out to me was 50% of the U.S. workforce is going to need a radical new skilled training by 2027. I think one of the panelists said. Kathryn, let's start with you on this one. What's your advantage at NYU, being at NYU on this? And, how do you think this applies to our industry, obviously around AI? But are we already, I mean, 2027 is not very far away. How are we doing this in our own business?
Yeah, well, let me start with the tools of the trade may evolve and change, but the strategy, the value, and how we do our work doesn't. So I think that sweet spot that, you know, um, we see from the very founding in the early days of PR, engaging publics and thinking more broadly about how an organization builds reputation, that will still hold true. I think we need to get smart on the tactics and what those look like. That's what I see shifting. At NYU, we constantly update our curriculum. We're doing a lot with, AI, Miss and Dis, but we're really, challenging our students to use it to make you better and to upskill. I would say there was a lot of noise this summer about an MIT study that talked about, young learners in particular using AI and having a very negative impact, right? Eroding critical thinking skills. And I know this unleashed a lot of discussion and debate. So we tell all of our students AI can help you get a starting point, but we focus on how do you think and what is your strategy and how do you, take all of this information and make it the magic that we're famous for. I think that's the critical skill that we need to really be focusing on and embrace, the legwork and the work that AI is able to provide quickly and easily. But the magic, the creativity, the courageousness, all of that in our business has been a real definer of our profession, and I think it'll continue to define us.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Jen, did you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I agree. I would just say that I think the I think maybe how we define critical skill sets might change, but I think again it goes back to how we teach people to really challenge AI and the outputs, right? And we know that even the training, that AI pulls from can have bias. So I think people need to constantly be asking the right questions. AI cannot understand cultural nuance, right? It can't read the tone of a community and the sentiment. So having people that really understand how to analyze the outputs is, I think, the critical skill set that, the next generation will need.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And, I think there was some concern, right, on stage about, whether outsourcing so much research, so much writing will have an impact on the critical thinking skills of this sort of next generation? And are they learning to be critical of AI and, being, spotting hallucinations or other biases, right? Instead of just sort of taking it at face value. Something else that came up that I thought was also interesting is that when it comes to GEO, I think is several, like, which is, generative engine optimization, several panelists noted that we're sort of in this unique moment where the generative engines are currently fueled by earned media. However, like if history is any guide, right, these platforms are going to evolve towards sort of paid content driving results. So does this mean that the skills that we're using to sort of program AI is going to become obsolete as these platforms become, shift towards paid content? And what does this mean for the long-term sort of trust in generative engines? I'm just curious if you all have any thoughts on that.
I do. I mean, I definitely think if the models change to paid, it will shift how we emphasize how our clients or how our brands show up, through AI. But I think we still need to prioritize writing for humans, but the way that we structure the writing, right? The way that we repeat patterns, the way that we insert keywords, I think we can still write with an authentic human tone, but write structure the content for AI and what AI prioritizes. But I think, it goes back to the other question of if the model is prioritized paid, I do think that's going to weaken, consumer trust in how they turn to AI for, an objective point of view.
Mhm.
Fair. I think that's fair. I agree.
Mhm. So this, and I'm glad that you pointed that out, Jen, because I think there were some panelists as well who sort of talked about how we needed to craft two different narratives now, right? Like one
Yeah.
that, emotionally resonates with humans, and another one that's sort of legible to machines. And what you're saying is that, yeah, we can sort of do those together and sort of do those with both sort of audiences in mind. I put audiences in quotes, but the
Yeah.
non-human audiences and human audiences. So, I mean, this all sort of ladders up to sort of another theme, right, that dominated the conference, and that's that we're living in an exceptionally disruptive moment, right? I think one panelist said, we're in a moment in our profession where there's going to be more change in the next 5 years than there has been in the previous 5 decades. I don't know. Does that feel true?
I can take a crack at that. So one of the things that I think is true, and this has been true since the pandemic, radically changed our role, right? The pandemic proved that we were a business necessity, and I think it was our opportunity to not just step up externally, but really internally. I think we proved our value. The challenge is the reward for doing good work is doing more good work and getting more and more good work. In fact, Paige did a benchmarking study and we asked about are your budgets growing or are they stable or are you losing budget? And the good news is that 75% of our members either grew or had stable budgets. So that shows us that what we bring to the table is hugely valuable. The flip side of that coin in the same study is that most people don't feel that they're adequately resourced. So one of the reasons I'm really excited about AI is I think it will help communicators prioritize differently and help us move some of the easier, more routine, repeatable tasks off to technology and take up less of our time and allow us to focus on what's important. I think it's incumbent on our profession to really say, here's where we add value. And one thing I would love for communicators to learn is how to say no. I did an entire presentation one time on for my team, here are 100 different ways to say no without using the word no,
Hmm.
because we need to prioritize and help ourselves have the time to be effective and strategic and have the thought time. And what I worry about in our profession is we spend too much time running and running and running and all these time sensitive issues. And we've divided ourselves up in so many different ways to cover, all of the different challenges that, it is leading to burnout. It is leading to people who, are frustrated. And I think we are our best when we are engaged and have a little bit of time to just think.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great point. And an ideal, situation or circumstance, right? AI will sort of free up a little bit more of that time, and some of those tasks that can be easily automated or outsourced to AI will free up time to do some of that bigger creative thinking, that bigger strategic thinking that I think most people in our industry, this is the work that excites us, that inspires us. Um, Jen, anything that you wanted to add to that?
No, I mean, I agree that I think that the need for communications function is only going to, become more important. I'm going to reference the age of rage conversation. There's a data point I wrote down because it struck me that 63% of the population says that across 16 industries, when they do business with companies, that they expect these companies to never, rarely, or only sometimes do the right thing.
Huh.
Right. And the whole conversation was around consumers feeling, not that you don't care about me anymore, but you're taking advantage of me. Right. And I think that the environment we're living in will only make that heighten that sentiment. So I think, a key role of our function is to rebuild trust, right, with constituents, whether that's your consumer, your employees, your investors, whoever that is. And I think that, we're in the business of building relationships and building back trust. So I think that, I see a lot of opportunity for us to still provide a very valuable service for, the clients we work with.
So that I love that stat because it sort of builds on another observation that I sort of jotted down that I thought was really interesting. Is that when there is a crisis, right? Maybe business continuity isn't the only metric for like success that we need to look at. And someone on one of the panelists said relationship continuity is exceptionally important right now. And just because your organization achieved operational recovery doesn't guarantee that they've recovered sort of key relationships. So I think what you're saying here, right, is that that focusing on those key relationships is key, and that's something that we as communicators can do and take the lead on in our organizations, outside of just the operational continuity when when you're recovering from, whether it's something a small crisis, a small, or, to something catastrophic potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the gist of that conversation was that, once relationships are broken, they're harder to restore even in operations. So it's critical to really make sure that you're in touch with the sentiment of your key audiences and, you're asking the hard questions, have you built the trust of, your employees? Do your employees believe that your values align with your actions, right? All of those, it's a bit of soul searching, right, for companies to make sure that they're maintaining those relationships.
I agree with Jen, and particularly check mark on the internal communications front. I think the employees are a really critical relationship that many CEOs mistakenly think, oh, they're on our payroll and they'll be aligned. And what we're seeing is that that's not the case. The issues that are dividing our country are dividing our companies, and employees have really strong feelings. It's not the company against a regulator anymore. These issues that we're dealing with are employee v. employee in some cases.
So this idea of sort of doing the right thing, right? I mean, this sort of dances around purpose, right? Which this topic, purpose, not only dominated industry conferences for the last like 5+ years, but entire conferences were built around this. And while purpose was certainly an underlying thread into many of the sessions on stage, it wasn't center stage anymore, right? It wasn't. I think if anything, I think AI was. Do you think this is a reflection of how purpose is being sort of talked about within organizations? Do you think it's been sidelined, or do you think it's just sort of been embedded into, all streams of conversation?
Yeah, I'll say purpose to me is always at the core of a company's conversation, and I can attest from, being a CCO at 5 different organizations, CEOs still really focus on purpose. In fact, they're using, their purpose and their values to really take radical action. And just take a look at the number of CEOs who have been exited because of inconsistencies with the company's values. So it's certainly there and very important. I put this in the important category versus the urgent. And I think what you see sometimes is people spending time on the urgent, that may not mean that something that's important has shifted in importance. It just means it may not be high on that urgency scale. Jen?
I absolutely think purpose is, critical, but I think the way that companies maybe are talking about purpose has shifted, right? And I think, one of the quotes I loved was actually from Paul, who said cultural fluency is the new holy grail. He saw that, at Cannes this year. And I think that's because maybe leaning into culture feels just a little less risky, right, than leaning into purpose, right, where we're so divided in our beliefs and, no brand wants to put a target on their back. So, leaning into culture, while still can have risk, feels a little safer, and I think it feels like a way to connect with consumers that maybe isn't, as emotional as maybe a purpose-driven campaign, but certainly it makes it drives relevance for brands and it makes consumers feel like you're connected to what they care about. So I think, that won't go away anytime soon.
So I'm gonna take off my moderator hat for a minute. I'm gonna put on my CMO hat for M Booth for a moment. So I mean, to your
Sure.
point, like I mean, I think that's an excellent point about cultural fluency, and I'm just gonna plug the fact that M Booth did we did do a white paper on this called Culture, and we'll hopefully include that in the show notes. So have a look at that because I think you're right, and there are different like vectors and different ways that brands can engage with culture. That's not that depending on their appetite for risk. But no, I'm putting my moderator hat back on. And I guess I still had my moderator hat on for that comment. Building on what you just said, Jen, right? The way that, we're framing purpose or the way we're framing some social issues is changing. I think one of the panelists said that, organizations may be reluctant to talk about diversity, but like no one is shying away from innovation. And I think her exact quote was, groupthink is the killer of innovation. So this idea that, some of these purpose ideals are not going away, they're just being reframed for this sort of moment that we're living in, right? Kathryn, are you also seeing instances of that?
Um, you know, I I think so. But I don't know. When I think about kind of the trajectory and the path forward, I still look at I'm probably more of an optimist.
Mhm.
Jen?
Yeah.
I don't know if I've seen it reframed as innovation, but I think the key takeaway from that discussion was around the need to have diverse talent in our work streams, right? I think especially at an agency that is focused on creative ideation and ideas, right? We can't have creative live in an echo chamber.
Mhm.
And so we need to have teams that reflect the audiences of our clients. So, and people that will challenge, right, the ideas and that will question the narratives that we're creating. So I think, we need a little friction in our innovation process, and that comes by having, people that have different lived experiences.
Right. I love the way you said that. Like, we do
Mhm.
need to have friction in that creative process, right, to have the best outputs. So I know we're wrapping up, we're kind of winding down on time here, but I wanted to also, because I think you both mentioned trust, right? And I'm curious to hear a little bit from both of you in terms of how we communicate ambiguity and nuance in this era of distrust, misinformation, hallucinations, you name it. And I'll just tee this up with a stat that stood out. And again, we can take this beyond the healthcare realm, but that's one place where there's some obvious examples. Um, I think in one of the sessions, they noted that friends and family are more trusted than scientists and health experts for health information today. And 53% of respondents in the survey that was referenced expressed distrust in institutions addressing their healthcare needs. And the majority believe that societal leaders mislead them on health matters. So that's pretty heavy. And that shows, a lot of distrust. And, healthcare is one area where, ambiguity and nuance is kind of necessary. So, do either of you have any thoughts on how we can communicate ambiguity and nuance in this era of sort of distrust?
Let me jump in on that because healthcare is definitely my sweet spot. And I think the data varies based on what type of health information you're talking about. There is a radical difference between making recommendations on hair growth serums versus a cancer medication. So I think your stats would change based on where you are at and what type of issue that you're looking at addressing. And I think what we need to help people understand more in health communications is, what's backed by science and data and how to understand data, and areas that, are highly experimental and that they should be, seen as experimental therapies and treatments. When patients are going through a major health crisis, it's hard to sift through all of the data and information. And in fact, I'd like to say one of the things that was really inspiring from the conference was for me watching all of the SABR Award winners. And there were excellent uses of AI and building and creating and doing things to inspire you to change reputation and to build trust in ways that just blew me away. So I highly recommend following some of those winners. But again, I go back to I'm an optimist. I think there's incredible things that are to come, and that I think communicators are doing what we do best, and that's creatively problem solve, move the needle, and make things better.
Yeah.
And I'll just add, not necessarily from a healthcare perspective, but I do think, it's hard for consumers to know who to trust with so many different signals coming at them, right? Especially we're battling mis and disinformation like we never have before. And I thought one of the interesting conversations at the conference was around, emotion versus fact, right? And the fact that you cannot battle misinformation and deeply held beliefs with facts and data. So, the trick is really figuring out how do you get to the root of, the connection and the emotional connection between the person that's spreading the narrative and their relationship with that information, right? And then who do you use as the trusted voice to help, combat some of the mis and disinformation that's out there?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And Catherine, also to sort of build on what you were saying
Mhm.
about the Sabre winners, I believe, and I think the Provoke editors can include this in the show notes hopefully as well. There are videos. There's the list of the 40 global Sabre winners from Chicago, and they will have, I believe most of them have videos, so you can just sort of get like a sneak peek and look at kind of a glimpse into some of these winning and
And I think
campaigns.
I was going to say that I thought some of those campaigns were amazing, and but a lot of them were still purpose. And
Mhm.
granted, I know it was from
Mhm.
last year, but I wonder how that will shift next
Yes.
year.
Yeah, I mean, I was noticing that as well, right? And that was these were, I believe, and hopefully I don't have this wrong. Most of these, yeah, campaigns went because sort of were activated in 2024. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see in 2025 how that sort of shakes out for next year's conference, which maybe leads me. That's a good segue to my closing question for all of you. So, what do you think will be different, assuming that the three of us sit down after Provoke Global 2026? What do you think will be different from that event than what we're talking about here today?
Well, I can tell you what won't be different. We'll still be talking about AI,
Mhm.
but maybe what will be different is maybe some of the awards, the campaigns that are showcased will be about the best use of AI, right? And how AI is being used to propel our industry forward. So.
Yeah. I think the conversation will continue to be how do we lead from our function and how do we, move organizations and move key stakeholders and what's effective. Again, there's a piece of this that is the strategy, the positioning, the holistic look that I think our function is absolutely famous for. And I'm sure we'll be talking more about, tactics and successes, which of these products in AI are really making a difference or not. What I would love to see be on the agenda, more is how we keep inspiring and engaging the next level and generation of leaders. There's a lot going on to absorb right now. The market, the economic conditions, the political diversity, everything is, a challenge for communicators to work through. And I do worry about folks, using this as an opportunity to you know, step away from our industry and into other areas that they might deem a little easier to manage. But I think the magic and beauty of our function is you're constantly recreating a playbook and you're constantly, achieving the art of what people think is impossible. So I hope that we will spend, more time on, really making sure that the best and the brightest stay engaged and productive and help bring up the next generation of the best and the brightest.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. I know I've heard young folks say things like, okay, what's an AI proof like, industry to go into? And I think there is going to be some case to be made. And I don't know, Catherine, if you see this at NYU, that, there is a role for communications, there is a role for a human in the loop, so to speak, in communication, so that we aren't losing the best and the brightest, right? Who are saying to themselves, I don't know about that. Or, that looks like it looks like there could be a lot of displacement in communications, or so yeah, that's an interesting question that maybe we'll have more clarity around next year. Also, the playbook. I think one of the things that I thought was also really interesting is how, we used to have this like, okay, every year you come up with a, we have this like static playbook that, we make sort of
Mhm.
iterations to deal with different scenarios, and how that, not only is that not relevant anymore, but if you're going to have even any sort of strategy guide, like it's almost has to be quarterly now. That's like the longest I think you can probably rely on it. Because the world, to your point, to both of your points, right? How much change we're in the midst of. It's just you can't do it, year-long planning. Seems like that's also been a casualty of sort of the moment that we're living in. Um,
But
and
that's a shift, right? Because that means we have to build for agility, and that's not always
Mhm.
easy.
yes, exactly. We do have
Yeah.
to, yeah, absolutely. And one other thing that I wanted to just bring up is this because I think we had mentioned that whether or not this is a moment that brands might sort of shy away a little bit. This idea that it's promote versus protect, I think, came up in one of the panels. And I don't know, this idea that it's a binary, right? That you have to choose. You can either promote, but if you promote, you have your target on your back, or you need to sort of hunker down and be in sort of protection mode. Um, and I don't know, I thought that kind of I don't think it necessarily has to be an either or, right?
I would say sometimes it can be protect before you promote,
Mm,
right? And change the order, right? Because I think every creative brief now has some semblance of protect in it, and making sure that we're running scenarios and really understanding, what could happen before we put any work out into the market. So
Mhm.
I think, they live hand in hand. Sometimes the order might shift.
yep, yep,
Yeah, I agree with that. I would add though that um, you know, the fun in our business is, building and growing and doing things that are new and different, and that reflect what we're hearing from our wide group of constituents. So I think some of the best work I've seen has been, companies coming up with approaches to how to handle issues, where they're going to take a stand, where they won't take a stand, where the nuances are. I think we've done excellent work in that area, and I applaud people. I think we're being much more careful than, in the past when we would jump out and say, oh, good idea, let's run and do it today. I think I'm seeing a lot more thoughtful things, and even presentations that are going to boards, and a lot of, great buy-in. And again, I look at that and say that's our function doing what we do best.
yeah. Well, thank you, Jen and Kathryn, for joining the podcast today. Um, Thank you for Provoke Media for hosting this conversation. And I think this sort of wraps up. I think this is the official wrap to the Provoke Global Summit 2025. And again, I don't know, but I think this actually was the 13th summit, and I may one of the Provoke editors will correct me if I'm wrong, but hopefully the three of us will be there at the 14th, wherever that one might be, and we'll see how much so much of what we talked about sort of either comes to fruition, or how much that changes next year. But thank you again for both for joining.
Sounds great.
Thank you. Bye-bye.